The crimson sand of the arena stretched endlessly under twin suns, stained with the blood of 1,000 fallen warriors. Commander Zethkar of the Vorthan Empire watched from his golden throne as another challenger was dragged away, his 6 arms twisted at unnatural angles. The crowd's roar echoed through the massive Colosseum, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. For 3 cycles, he had ruled this place. 3 cycles since he had claimed the title of Arena Master after defeating the previous champion in single combat. The Kethvar Arena was more than just entertainment for the galaxy's elite. It was a proving ground where the strongest warriors from dozens of species came to test their might against each other. And at the center of it all stood Zethkar, undefeated, unmatched. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed in the harsh light, each piece polished to perfection by his servants. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with razor-sharp claws that could slice through steel and mandibles that could crush bone, he was the perfect predator. His species, the Vorthans, had conquered 17 star systems through pure physical dominance. They were born for war, bred for battle, and Zethkar was the finest example of their race. Another disappointment, he clicked to his aide, a smaller Vorthan who trembled at his words. The Rigelian champion lasted barely 5 minutes. I barely had time to warm up. Master, perhaps we should consider expanding our search parameters, the aide suggested nervously. There are rumors of strong warriors in the Outer Rim territories. Rumors, Zethkar scoffed, his mandibles clicking with disdain. I have faced the crystal warriors of Zirion, beings made of living diamond. I have crushed the bone breakers of Thanatos Prime, creatures that stand 4 meters tall and can lift starship engines with their bare hands. I have torn apart the shadow dancers of Nyx, assassins who can phase through matter itself. What could possibly challenge me in some backwater system? The aide pulled up a holographic display, scrolling through various files. Well, Master, there is one species we haven't encountered yet. They call themselves humans. They come from a small blue world in the Sol system. According to our intelligence, they're relatively new to the galactic community, only made first contact about 50 standard years ago. Zethkar leaned forward, his interest barely piqued. Physical capabilities? Modest, Master. They're bipedal, average height of about 1.8 meters, no natural weapons to speak of. No claws, no fangs, no armor plating. They seem to rely entirely on manufactured weapons and tools. A harsh laugh escaped Zethkar's throat, a sound like grinding metal. Tools? Weapons? What kind of warrior needs such crutches? Bring me one of these, humans. I could use some light entertainment before the main events. Actually, Master, the aide continued, his voice growing even more nervous. There's something unusual about the human governments. They've been very protective of their people. Our usual recruitment methods haven't worked. They refuse to send anyone to the arena voluntarily, and their military is surprisingly effective at protecting their borders. This gave Zethkar pause. In his experience, weaker species were usually eager to prove themselves or were easily intimidated into compliance. The fact that these humans were both weak and defiant was intriguing. Then, we'll take one, he declared. Send a raiding party to this Sol system. Bring me the strongest human they can find. If their governments won't cooperate, we'll simply bypass them entirely. 3 weeks later, Zethkar stood in the arena's preparation chambers, studying his newest acquisition. The human hung suspended in an energy cage, still unconscious from the neural dampeners used during his capture. He was disappointingly small, barely reaching Zethkar's chest even if he had been standing. His skin was a pale pink color, covered in strange markings that looked like scars, but formed deliberate patterns. His hair was a steel gray, and his face was lined with age. This is what they brought me, Zethkar demanded. An elderly specimen? I asked for their strongest warrior. Master, his aide consulted his data pad nervously. According to our intelligence, this is Sergeant Major Jake Morrison of the Terran Colonial Marines. He's considered one of their most decorated soldiers. The raid team said he was the most difficult target they've ever encountered. It took 17 of them to bring him down, and he wasn't even armed at the time. Zethkar examined the human more closely. There was something about him, a stillness that suggested coiled strength, like a blade resting in its sheath. But he was so small, so fragile-looking. What are those marks on his skin? We believe they're called tattoos, Master. Apparently, humans intentionally scar themselves with ink to commemorate battles or fallen comrades. This one has quite a collection. The human's eyes opened suddenly, startling the aide, but not Zethkar. They were a pale blue color, like winter ice, and they held no fear as they met Zethkar's gaze. Instead, there was something else there, a cold assessment, as if the human was cataloging every detail of his captor. "Good morning, sunshine," the human said, his voice rough but steady. "Nice place you've got here. Very evil alien overlord aesthetic. I'm guessing you're the one in charge." Zethkar was taken aback by the casual tone. Most creatures cowered when they first saw him. This human spoke as if they were meeting at a social gathering. "I am Commander Zethkar, master of the Kethvar arena," he declared, drawing himself up to his full height. "You will fight for my entertainment, human. If you survive long enough to amuse me, your death will be swift." The human, Morrison, actually smiled at this. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "And if I refuse?" "Refusal is not an option." Morrison looked around the chamber, taking note of the guards, the exit points, the energy cage containing him. His eyes moved with the methodical precision of someone conducting a tactical assessment. "So let me get this straight," he said finally. "You kidnapped me from my home, dragged me halfway across the galaxy, and now you want me to fight in some kind of gladiator arena for your amusement?" "Essentially, yes." Morrison nodded slowly. "Well, that's unfortunate for you." "Unfortunate? For me?" Zethkar's mandibles clicked with amusement. "You're the one who's going to die, human." "Maybe," Morrison acknowledged. "But you just made a very serious mistake." "And what mistake is that?" The human's smile widened, and, for the first time, Zethkar felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a small flicker of unease. "You kidnapped a United States Marine," Morrison said quietly. "More specifically, you kidnapped a Marine with 43 years of active service, including deployments in the Centauri conflict, the Siege of New Byzantium, and the Titan Uprising. You took someone who has buried more friends than you've probably met in your entire life. Someone who has seen things that would break most sentient minds. Someone who has fought in wars you can't imagine, against enemies you can't comprehend." Morrison leaned forward as much as the energy cage would allow, his pale eyes never leaving Zethkar's face. "You see, in all those years of fighting, I learned something important about warriors. Real warriors. It's not about size or strength or natural weapons. It's not about fangs or claws or armor plating. It's about what you're willing to do to complete the mission. It's about how far you're willing to go when everything else has failed. It's about finding that place inside yourself where death isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Failure is." The chamber had fallen completely silent except for the humming of the energy cage. Even the guards seemed to be listening. "So here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level, but somehow filling the entire room. "You're going to put me in that arena of yours. You're going to watch me fight whatever you throw at me. And you're going to learn something that your intelligence files didn't tell you about humans." "Which is what?" Zethkar found himself asking despite his better judgment. "That we don't just fight to win," Morrison said. "We fight to make sure that anyone who threatens our people, our homes, our way of life, regrets it for whatever short time they have left to regret anything at all." The silence stretched for long moments. Finally, Zethkar turned to his aide. "When is the next scheduled match?" "Tomorrow at midday, Master. You were supposed to fight the Krillian Beastmaster." "Cancel it. I want this human in the arena instead." He looked back at Morrison. "Let's see if your words carry as much weight as your reputation suggests, Marine." Morrison settled back in the energy cage, closing his eyes as if preparing to take a nap. "Looking forward to it," he said calmly. As Zethkar left the chamber, he tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. It was ridiculous. The human was barely half his size and had no natural weapons. What could one small, aging creature possibly do against him in single combat? But that night, for the first time in years, Zethkar found himself researching his opponent instead of simply preparing his weapons. What he found in the human military records made him pause. 43 years of service. Over 200 confirmed combat deployments. Decorated 17 times for valor under fire. Wounded in action 14 times. all minor injuries that he had refused to let sideline him for more than a few days. But it was the personal commendations that made Zethkar's chitin crawl. Stories of Morrison single-handedly holding positions against impossible odds, of leading rescue missions into hostile territory to retrieve captured comrades, of refusing evacuation orders to stay with wounded soldiers, of surviving situations that had killed entire platoons. The more he read, the more he realized that Jake Morrison wasn't just a soldier. He was a weapon that had been forged in the fires of countless battles and tempered by decades of war. A weapon that was about to be turned loose in Zethkar's arena. For the first time since becoming arena master, Zethkar wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The next morning, as the twin suns rose over the arena, thousands of spectators began filing into the massive coliseum. Word had spread quickly through the station's communication networks about the mysterious new fighter, a human from the little-known Sol system who had supposedly given the arena master pause. Betting pools had formed, though the odds were heavily stacked against the unknown challenger. In the preparation chambers beneath the arena, Morrison was given basic combat gear, a simple sword and shield, light armor that barely covered his torso. Standard equipment for arena combats, designed more for spectacle than protection. The armor doesn't fit quite right, Morrison observed to his guard detail, adjusting the straps with practiced efficiency. But I suppose that's the point, isn't it? This whole setup is designed to favor your boss. The guards, a mix of Vorthan soldiers and hired mercenaries from various species, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They had seen countless challengers come through these chambers, and most were either terrified or raging with false bravado by now. This human seemed almost relaxed. Afraid, human. One of the Vorthan guards clicked mockingly. Morrison looked up from adjusting his gear, considering the question seriously. Terrified, he admitted easily. Fear keeps you alive. Fear makes you think clearly. The warriors who aren't afraid are usually the first ones to die because they do something stupid. Then, why do you seem so calm? Morrison finished with his armor and stood, testing the weight of the sword in his hand. It was crude by human standards, but well-balanced. Because being afraid and being paralyzed by fear are two different things, he explained. Fear is just information. It tells you that what you're about to do is dangerous. But I've been doing dangerous things for 4 decades. Fear and I are old friends by now. Above them, they could hear the crowd's roar growing louder as the time for the match approached. Morrison closed his eyes and began what appeared to be some kind of mental preparation ritual, his breathing becoming slow and controlled. "What are you doing?" another guard asked. "Remembering," Morrison said without opening his eyes. "Remembering every friend I've lost to creatures like your master. Every innocent person who died because someone thought they could take whatever they wanted from humanity. Every reason why I'm going to walk out of that arena alive while your boss doesn't." The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was something unsettling about the human's quiet confidence, something that made their combat instincts whisper warnings they couldn't quite understand. A chime sounded, echoing through the chamber. "Time to go," Morrison said, opening his eyes. The pale blue had somehow become even more intense, like the heart of a glacier. He walked toward the arena entrance with the steady pace of someone heading to work. As the massive doors began to grind open, revealing the blood-soaked sand of the arena beyond, one of the younger guards found himself calling out, "Human, what makes you think you can defeat our master?" Morrison paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the blazing light of the arena. When he looked back, his expression was almost pitying. "Son," he said quietly, "your master has fought many warriors. Strong ones, fast ones, clever ones. But he's never fought someone who learned his trade in the worst places the universe has to offer. He's never fought someone who's been to hell, and back so many times that hell doesn't scare him anymore." The doors finished opening, and the crowd's roar washed over them like a physical force. "Most importantly," Morrison added, stepping into the light, "he's never fought a United States Marine who's been given permission to take the gloves off." And, with that, Sergeant Major Jake Morrison walked into the Kethvar arena to face the undefeated champion, carrying with him 43 years of hard-earned knowledge about war, death, and what it really meant to be a warrior. In the stands, Zethkar watched his approach and felt his confidence waver for the first time in years. There was something about the way the human moved, not with the swagger of an untested fighter or the desperation of the condemned, but with the economical grace of someone who had survived too many battles to waste motion on unnecessary displays. The arena fell silent as the two fighters approached the center, predator and prey facing each other across the blood-stained sand. But as Zethkar looked into Morrison's pale blue eyes, he began to wonder which of them was which. The arena announcer's voice boomed across the Colosseum in a dozen different languages, each translation echoing through the communication implants of the diverse crowd. Spectators from across the galaxy had gathered to witness this unusual match. Many had never seen a human before, and the betting odds reflected their skepticism. "Citizens and honored guests," the announcer proclaimed. "Today we witness a historic first combat. In the red corner, our undefeated champion, the Scourge of 17 Systems, master of the Kethvar arena, Commander Zethkar of the Vorthan Empire." The crowd erupted as Zethkar raised all 6 of his arms, his razor-sharp claws gleaming in the twin sunlight. His chitinous exoskeleton had been polished to a mirror shine, each piece fitted with ceremonial engravings that told the story of his victories. Standing 3 meters tall and weighing nearly half a ton, he was a monument to predatory evolution. And, in the blue corner, the announcer continued, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "From the primitive world's soul, 3, we have the challenger, Jake Morrison of the Terran Colonial Marines." The response was noticeably muted. A few curious cheers mixed with derisive laughter as the crowd took in Morrison's appearance. Next to Zethkar's imposing presence, the human looked almost comically outmatched. Gray-haired, scarred, and barely reaching the Vorthan's chest, he stood quietly in the center of his starting circle, apparently unmoved by the crowd's reaction. Morrison used the time during the introductions to study his opponent more carefully. Zethkar was impressive, no question about that. The Vorthan's exoskeleton would deflect most conventional weapons, and those claws could probably slice through the arena's energy barriers if needed. 6 arms meant multiple attack vectors and superior reach. The mandibles looked strong enough to crush steel. But Morrison had spent 4 decades learning to find weaknesses in impossible situations, and every creature had them. The joints where the exoskeleton segments met, those would be softer, more vulnerable. The eyes, while well protected by bony ridges, were still organic and exposed. The way Zethkar moved suggested his lower arms were primarily for grappling, while the upper arms did the striking, which created predictable patterns. Most importantly, the Vorthan moved like someone who had never faced a truly dangerous opponent, confident to the point of carelessness. "Combatants, prepare," the announcer called. Morrison tested the weight of his sword one more time. It was a simple blade, well-made but unremarkable. The shield was basic but solid. Against most opponents, it would be adequate equipment. Against Zethkar, it was barely better than nothing, which was fine. Morrison had learned long ago that the weapon didn't make the warrior. "Begin." Zethkar immediately launched himself forward with surprising speed for his size. All 6 arms extended and claws aimed at Morrison's torso. It was an intimidating display, a wall of razor-sharp death rushing toward the human with enough force to tear him apart. Morrison didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped forward and to the right, his movement minimal but precisely timed. Zethkar's claws whistled through empty air as Morrison slipped past the Vorthan's guard and brought his sword up in a quick cut along Zethkar's left flank. The blade skittered harmlessly off the exoskeleton, but Morrison hadn't expected it to penetrate. He was testing, gathering information about his opponent's armor, reflexes, and fighting style. But speed will not save you from inevitability. Morrison didn't respond. He never talked during combat unless it served a tactical purpose, and nothing he could say would give him an advantage here. Instead, he began to circle, forcing Zethkar to turn and giving himself time to study his opponent's movement patterns. Zethkar advanced again, this time more cautiously. He had noted the human's speed and was adjusting his approach accordingly. His attacks came in measured sequences: probe with the upper arms, grab with the lower, finish with the mandibles. It was an effective strategy that had probably served him well against other humanoid opponents. But Morrison wasn't other opponents. When Zethkar's upper claws came down in a killing strike, Morrison stepped inside the arc instead of away from it. The move put him dangerously close to the Vorthin's mandibles, but it also negated the reach advantage of the longer arms. Morrison's sword came up in a quick thrust, not at Zethkar's armored torso, but at the joint where his upper right arm connected to his shoulder. The blade found the gap between armor plates and slipped in several centimeters before Zethkar's reflexes carried him away from the attack. Dark blue blood welled from the wound. Not serious, but unexpected. The crowd's murmur suggested they hadn't seen their champion bleed in quite some time. Zethkar looked down at the wound with what might have been surprise, then back at Morrison with new respect. Clever, he admitted. But you cannot repeat that trick forever. This time he attacked with more discipline, keeping his vulnerable joints covered and using his reach advantage more effectively. His upper arms worked in coordination, forcing Morrison to defend against multiple simultaneous attacks, while his lower arms waited for an opening to grapple. Morrison found himself giving ground steadily. The Vorthin was learning, adapting, and the arena wasn't large enough to avoid contact indefinitely. His shield took a glancing blow that sent numbing vibrations up his arm, and one of Zethkar's claws left a shallow cut across his shoulder as he failed to dodge completely. The crowd began to cheer as their champion pressed his advantage. This was what they had come to see, the methodical dismantling of another challenger by their undefeated hero. But those paying close attention might have noticed that Morrison didn't seem concerned by his tactical retreat. His movements remained controlled, economical, almost patient. He wasn't fighting desperately. He was studying. Zethkar closed in for what looked like a finishing combination. His upper arms swept in a coordinated strike that would force Morrison to block with his shield, leaving him open for the lower arms to pin him in place for the mandibles to finish the job. It was a proven technique that had ended dozens of previous matches. Morrison's shield came up to block as expected, but instead of trying to absorb the impact, he angled it to deflect Zethkar's claws downward while he dropped low and rolled between the Vorthin's legs. As he came up behind his opponent, his sword found another joint gap, this one at the back of Zethkar's left knee. The blade went deeper this time, eliciting a hiss of pain from the Vorthin as he stumbled slightly. Morrison was already moving again, staying in Zethkar's blind spot and forcing the larger creature to turn awkwardly to face him. "You fight like a scavenger," Zethkar snarled, his earlier respect replaced by irritation. "Nipping at the edges like a coward instead of meeting strength with strength." Morrison finally spoke, his voice calm and conversational despite his exertion. "I fight like someone who wants to go home alive," he replied. "Honor's a luxury for people who haven't seen what I've seen." The next exchange lasted longer, both combatants probing for openings while the crowd's cheers grew louder. Zethkar's superior strength and reach were evident, but Morrison's experience was beginning to show. He anticipated attacks before they fully developed, positioned himself to minimize damage when he couldn't avoid contact entirely, and consistently found the smallest gaps in his opponent's defenses. More blue blood stained the sand. Small wounds, individually insignificant, but accumulating. Zethkar was learning that fighting the human was like trying to battle smoke. Every time he thought he had Morrison trapped, the man found a way to slip away and strike back from an unexpected angle. "How?" Zethkar demanded during a brief pause as they circled each other. His breathing was becoming labored, and several of his joints were weeping blood. "How does a creature so small, so weak, fight like this?" Morrison glanced up at the royal box where Zethkar had been sitting before the match. Other Vorthin nobles were watching intently, their earlier casual interest replaced by obvious concern for their champion. "You want to know the difference between us?" Morrison asked, deflecting another claw strike and opening a shallow cut on Zethkar's wrist in return. "You fight because you're strong. You fight because you can. You fight because no one has ever been able to stop you." He rolled away from a grabbing attempt and came up with his sword pointed at Zethkar's throat, just out of reach, but positioned for a quick thrust if the Vorthin overextended. "I fight because I have to," Morrison continued. "I fight because if I don't, people die. People I care about. People who are depending on me to come home and keep them safe." Zethkar lunged forward, accepting Morrison's blade between his shoulder plates in exchange for getting close enough to grab the human with his lower arms. It should have been a successful trade. Morrison's sword was now trapped, and the Vorthin's crushing grip would finish him in seconds. But Morrison didn't try to pull his sword free. Instead, he used it as an anchor point, hauling himself up and driving his knee into Zethkar's throat with all the force he could muster. The impact wasn't enough to seriously injure the armored Vorthin, but it was enough to loosen his grip. Morrison broke free, leaving his sword embedded in Zethkar's shoulder, and snatched up a handful of sand as he rolled away. "The thing about fighting for something bigger than yourself," Morrison said, breathing hard but still moving with purpose, "is that it teaches you things that fighting for glory never can." Zethkar yanked the sword from his shoulder and threw it aside, dark blue blood streaming down his arm. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something Morrison recognized, the dawning realization that this fight wasn't going according to plan. "What things?" Zethkar demanded, advancing more cautiously now. Morrison smiled grimly, the sand still clutched in his fist. "That winning isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the toughest," he said. "Winning is about being the one who's still standing when it's over. Whatever it takes." Zethkar attacked again, but his movements had become more desperate, less controlled. The accumulating wounds were taking their toll, and Morrison's refusal to be intimidated or overwhelmed was clearly affecting the Vorthin's confidence. Morrison continued his pattern of evasion and counterattack, but now he was moving with greater purpose. Each strike targeted the same joints he had wounded before, deepening the cuts and restricting Zethkar's mobility. The crowd's cheers had become noticeably quieter as their champion struggled to land a decisive blow against the elusive human. "Stand still and fight," Zethkar roared, frustration overcoming tactical discipline as he launched a wild assault with all 6 arms. Morrison didn't stand still. Instead, he did something that stunned everyone watching. He charged directly at the wall of claws and death rushing toward him. At the last second, he dropped to his knees and slid across the blood-slicked sand, passing between Zethkar's legs again. As he went by, he released the handful of sand directly into the Vorthin's eyes. Zethkar's roar of rage became a bellow of pain as the coarse particles scraped across his sensitive optical organs. He spun blindly, claws windmilling in all directions, trying to clear his vision while preventing Morrison from exploiting the opening. But Morrison was already inside his guard, shield discarded, both hands gripping one of Zethkar's own claws. In the few seconds while the Vorthin was blinded and disoriented, Morrison twisted with every ounce of strength in his body, using leverage and momentum to force Zethkar's claw against its natural joint movement. The sound of chitinous armor cracking was clearly audible even over the crowd's shocked gasps. Zethkar's upper left claw hung at an unnatural angle, useless. Morrison didn't pause to admire his work. While Zethkar was still reacting to the injury, he snatched up his discarded sword and drove it deep into the joint between the Vorthin's neck and shoulder, one of the few places where the armor couldn't provide protection. This time, the blade went deep enough to matter. Zethkar staggered, his intact arms clutching at the wound as blood poured freely onto the sand. For the first time in the match, he looked vulnerable. More than that, he looked mortal. The arena had fallen completely silent except for the Vorthin's labored breathing and the sound of blood dripping onto sand. Morrison stood a few meters away, unarmed again, but ready to move. His own injuries were minor compared to what he had inflicted, and his breathing was still controlled despite the exertion. "You asked what makes me different," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "The difference is that I learned a long time ago that fair fights are for people who have a choice. I've never had that luxury." Zethkar tried to advance again, but his coordination was failing. The neck wound was affecting his motor control, and the accumulated damage was finally taking its toll. He stumbled, caught himself, and looked up at Morrison with something that might have been understanding. "You're not what our intelligence reports described," he admitted. Morrison nodded. "Intelligence reports can tell you about hardware and capabilities. They can't tell you about heart. They can't tell you about determination. And they sure as hell can't tell you what someone's willing to sacrifice to protect what they care about. The human began to circle again, but now Zethkar was the one being hunted. The predator had become prey, and everyone watching could sense the shift in momentum. In the royal box, the Vorthan nobles were no longer lounging in their seats. They were leaning forward, their expressions grim as they watched their supposedly invincible champion struggle against a creature they had dismissed as insignificant. "Your empire," Morrison said conversationally as he continued to circle, "built itself on the idea that might makes right, that the strong deserve to rule the weak. That's worked out pretty well for you so far, hasn't it?" Zethkar didn't answer, focusing all his remaining strength on tracking Morrison's movement and preparing for the next attack. "But here's the thing about that philosophy," Morrison continued. "It only works until you meet someone who's stronger. Someone who's faced worse things than you can imagine and survived. Someone who's been forged in fires that would melt your exoskeleton." The next exchange was brief, but decisive. Zethkar, desperate to regain control of the fight, committed everything to one final assault. All his remaining functional arms swept toward Morrison in a coordinated attack that should have been impossible to evade in the limited space available. Morrison didn't try to evade. Instead, he stepped inside the attack range and grabbed Zethkar's wounded neck with both hands, using the Vorthan's own momentum to drive his thumbs deep into the existing sword wound. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Zethkar's coordination collapsed entirely as Morrison's grip disrupted the major nerve clusters in his neck. The massive Vorthan crashed to the sand, his limbs twitching uncontrollably as his nervous system struggled to cope with the trauma. Morrison held his grip for a few more seconds, ensuring that the damage was permanent, then stepped back and retrieved his sword from where it had fallen. The arena remained silent as Morrison stood over his fallen opponent. Zethkar was still alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes were glazed with shock and pain. "The thing about humans," Morrison said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "is that we don't just fight to win. We fight to make sure that anyone who threatens our people learns to regret it." He raised his sword, preparing to deliver the killing blow that would officially end the match. In the royal box, one of the Vorthan nobles half rose from his seat, his hand moving toward a weapon. But before he could draw, Morrison's pale blue eyes fixed on him across the arena, and something in that gaze made the noble freeze. "I wouldn't," Morrison called out calmly. "You start shooting into this arena, and I guarantee you won't like how this ends." The noble's hand moved away from his weapon. Morrison looked down at Zethkar one last time. The fallen champion was trying to speak, his mandibles working soundlessly as he struggled to form words. You were right," Zethkar finally managed to whisper. "We had never fought a warrior like you." Morrison nodded once, then drove his sword through Zethkar's heart with surgical precision. As the former arena master died, Morrison stood slowly and surveyed the silent crowd. Thousands of alien faces stared back at him, their expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that might have been respect. "Ladies, gentlemen, and whatever other categories apply," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "My name is Sergeant Major Jake Morrison, United States Colonial Marines. I represent a species that you apparently thought was weak enough to kidnap and use for entertainment." He gestured toward Zethkar's body. "I hope this demonstration has been educational." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before someone in the crowd began to clap. Others joined in, slowly at first, then, with growing enthusiasm as the reality of what they had witnessed sank in. A human, a single, aging human with basic weapons, had just defeated the undefeated champion of the galaxy's most prestigious arena. More than that, he had made it look inevitable once he got serious about it. In the royal box, the surviving Vorthan nobles huddled together in urgent discussion. Their entire worldview had just been challenged by one small creature from a backwater world they had never taken seriously. Morrison stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by the applause of thousands of beings who were just beginning to understand that perhaps they had underestimated humanity. The real question was what happened next. The medical bay of the arena station was a marvel of galactic technology, equipped to treat injuries from dozens of different species. Morrison sat on an examination table while a spider-like arachnid medic tended to his wounds with 6 delicate manipulator arms. The cuts and bruises from his fight with Zethkar were minor, painful, but not life-threatening. Remarkable, the medic chittered in heavily accented galactic standard. Your physiology shows stress patterns consistent with extreme combat, but your actual injuries are minimal. Most beings who face Commander Zethkar require extensive reconstructive surgery, assuming they survive at all. Morrison winced as the medic sealed a particularly deep cut on his shoulder. Experience helps, knowing where to be and where not to be when the shooting starts. This was not shooting, the medic pointed out with what might have been amusement. This was close-quarters combat with edged weapons and natural armaments. Same principles apply, Morrison replied. Violence is violence, whether it's bullets or claws. The trick is staying calm enough to think your way through it. The medical bay's main door hissed open, and several figures entered. Morrison recognized them from the royal box, high-ranking Vorthans based on their elaborate armor and ceremonial scarification. Their leader was a female slightly smaller than Zethkar had been, but with an air of authority that made her seem larger. I am Admiral Vex Than, military governor of this sector, she announced without preamble. You have created complications. Morrison nodded politely while continuing to let the medic work. Ma'am, sorry about your champion. He fought well. Vex Than's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. If Morrison remembered the cultural briefings correctly, Zethkar was more than a champion. He was a symbol of Vorthan supremacy. His defeat by a supposedly primitive human has implications. I imagine it does, Morrison agreed calmly. Already, reports of your victory are spreading through the communication networks. Our subject species are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Vorthan invincibility. Some are even suggesting that if humans can defeat our greatest warriors, perhaps they could defeat us as well. Morrison finished pulling on his shirt and turned to face the Admiral properly. And that worries you. It concerns me greatly, Vex Than admitted. The Vorthan Empire controls 17 star systems containing over 40 billion sentient beings. Our authority rests on the perception that resistance is futile. When that perception is challenged, she left the sentence hanging. But Morrison could fill in the blanks. Information, Vex Than said immediately. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Our intelligence suggested that humans were a minor species with limited military capabilities. Clearly, our intelligence was incorrect. Morrison considered his response carefully. He was in a delicate position. One wrong word could endanger not just himself, but Earth's position in the broader galactic community. With respect, Admiral, your intelligence wasn't wrong about human capabilities. It was wrong about human nature. Explain. Morrison gestured toward the arena beyond the medical bay walls. Zethkar was stronger than me, faster than me, better armed and armored. On paper, he should have won that fight easily. But paper doesn't account for motivation. Motivation, why you fight matters more than how well you fight, Morrison explained. Zethkar fought because he was good at it, because it brought him status and respect, because he enjoyed proving his superiority over others. Vex Than leaned forward slightly, her interest obvious. I fought because my species is in danger, Morrison continued. Because someone thought they could kidnap human citizens without consequences. Because failing to send that message might encourage others to try the same thing. And that difference in motivation was sufficient to overcome his physical advantages? Morrison smiled grimly. Admiral, I've spent 43 years learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and tougher than me. Alien predators, enemy soldiers, war machines, environmental hazards that could crush a starship. When your survival depends on beating opponents who outclass you physically, you get very good at finding other ways to win. The Admiral exchanged glances with her subordinates. Morrison could practically see them recalculating their assessment of human military potential. Tell me about these wars you've fought, Vex Than demanded. Our records show that humanity has been space-capable for less than a century. How could you have accumulated such extensive combat experience? Morrison's expression darkened. Because the universe is a dangerous place, Admiral. And because humans have a talent for ending up in the middle of other people's conflicts. Over the next hour, Morrison provided a carefully edited overview of human military history since first contact. The Centauri conflict, where human peacekeepers had intervened to stop a genocide. The siege of New Byzantium, where human marines had held a refugee evacuation site against impossible odds. The Titan uprising, where human special forces had ended a terrorist campaign that had paralyzed 3-star systems. What he didn't mention was how those conflicts had shaped human military doctrine, how each engagement had taught new lessons about fighting alien opponents with superior technology or physical capabilities, how the colonial marines had evolved into one of the galaxy's most effective military forces precisely because they specialized in impossible situations. Impressive, Vex then admitted when he finished. But these were all defensive actions, humanitarian interventions, nothing that suggests aggressive expansionist capabilities. That's true, Morrison agreed. Humans generally don't start wars. We just tend to finish them. Meaning? Morrison's pale blue eyes met the Admiral's gaze directly. Meaning that when someone threatens human citizens or human interests, we respond with whatever level of force is necessary to resolve the situation permanently. The implications hung in the air between them. Vex then was beginning to understand that her empire had inadvertently provoked a species that might be more dangerous than their initial assessment suggested. What would constitute an appropriate resolution to the current situation? She asked carefully. Morrison had been thinking about that question since his fight ended. The smart play would be to negotiate his own release and let diplomats handle the larger issues. But sometimes the smart play wasn't the right play. That depends, he said finally. Are there other humans being held in arenas like this one? Vexthen's silence was answer enough. How many? Morrison pressed. 7 other facilities in Vorthan space currently house human combatants, one of the Admiral's subordinates admitted reluctantly. Perhaps 20 individuals total. Morrison felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. 20 humans, kidnapped from their homes and forced to fight for alien entertainment. 20 people who were counting on someone to come for them, even if they didn't know it yet. Then, here's what's going to happen, Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone he had once used to brief newly arrived replacements. You're going to release all of those people. You're going to provide them with safe passage back to human space. And you're going to issue a formal apology to the human colonial government for violating our territorial sovereignty. Vexthen's mandibles clicked rapidly again. And if we refuse? Morrison stood up slowly, testing his newly treated injuries. The medic had done good work. He felt almost as good as new. Admiral, do you know what the worst part of my job has been over the past 4 decades? He asked conversationally. I'm sure you'll tell me. Writing letters to the families of soldiers who didn't come home, Morrison said quietly. Explaining to a wife that her husband died holding a position so others could evacuate. Telling parents that their son gave his life protecting civilians he'd never met. Sitting with children who would never see their mother again because she chose duty over safety. He walked to the medical bay's observation window, looking out at the arena where Zethkar's body was being removed. Those letters are the reason I'm very good at my job, Admiral. Every time I write one, I remember that someone else's family is depending on me to bring their loved one home safely. It's a powerful motivator. Vex then followed his gaze to the arena. You're threatening war over 20 individuals? Morrison turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression that made the Vorthan Admiral take an involuntary step backward. I'm not threatening war, he said calmly. I'm promising it. If those 20 people aren't returned safely to human space within 1 standard week, the human colonial government will consider it an act of war against our entire species. And I guarantee you that the response will be swift, decisive, and permanent. You cannot seriously believe that your small military could threaten the Vorthan Empire, Vex then protested, but there was uncertainty in her voice. Morrison smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Admiral, 6 hours ago you thought one aging human couldn't threaten your undefeated champion. How did that work out for you? The comparison clearly struck home. Vex then exchanged another series of glances with her subordinates, and Morrison could see them wrestling with the same question that had probably been troubling them since his victory. If they had been so wrong about one human, what else might they be wrong about? Even assuming you could somehow threaten our military forces, Vex then said finally, the political cost would be enormous. War between our species would destabilize this entire region of space. You should have thought of that before you started kidnapping our people, Morrison replied without sympathy. But you're right about the political costs, which is why I'm giving you a chance to resolve this quietly. And what guarantee do we have that releasing these individuals will satisfy human demands? Morrison considered the question seriously. None, he admitted. But I can tell you that failing to release them will absolutely guarantee the alternative. The silence stretched for several minutes as Vex then weighed her options. Finally, she spoke. If we agree to your terms, how do we know that humans won't use this as a precedent for future demands? Because humans don't work that way, Morrison explained. We're not interested in conquering your empire or imposing our will on your people. We just want to be left alone to live our lives and protect our own. But if you make the mistake of threatening what we care about, he let the sentence trail off. But the implication was clear. Vex then made her decision. Very well. The humans in our arenas will be released and returned to your territory. But understand that this gesture comes at considerable cost to Vorthan prestige. I understand, Morrison acknowledged. And I appreciate your wisdom in choosing the path that avoids further escalation. However, Vex then continued, there is one additional matter to resolve. Morrison raised an eyebrow. You have won the championship of the Kethvar arena, the Admiral explained. According to our laws, that makes you the new arena master until someone defeats you in single combat. Morrison hadn't expected that particular complication. And if I refuse the position, then, by Vorthan law, you would forfeit your life. The position cannot remain vacant. Morrison rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache beginning to build. Military situations he could handle, but legal technicalities were a different kind of challenge entirely. How long do I have before someone challenges me? Traditionally, new champions are given one standard month to recover from their victory before accepting challenges, Vex then replied. But, given the unusual circumstances, the Arena Council might be willing to expedite the process. Morrison understood the subtext. They wanted him gone as quickly as possible, before his presence could do any more damage to Vorthan prestige. And if I keep winning? Vexthen's expression was unreadable. Then, you would remain Arena Master until someone finally defeats you or you die of natural causes. Morrison looked out at the arena again, thinking through his options. He could probably win a few more fights. His victory over Zethkar hadn't been a fluke, and his experience gave him advantages that most opponents wouldn't expect. But, eventually, someone would get lucky or prove genuinely superior, and then he'd be dead. On the other hand, holding the position might give him leverage to ensure that the released humans actually made it home safely. And it would certainly send a message to the rest of the galaxy about human capabilities. I accept the position, Morrison decided. But I want to modify the traditional rules. Modifications require unanimous consent from the Arena Council, Vex then warned. Then, I suggest you convince them, Morrison replied. Because the alternative is having a human arena master operating under the current rules, which I doubt anyone wants. After another brief discussion with her subordinates, Vex then agreed to present Morrison's proposals to the council. The modifications were simple enough. Any challenger who defeated Morrison would be required to guarantee the safety of human citizens in Vorthan space. Essentially, Morrison was using his position to create a legal framework that would protect his people even after his eventual defeat. 3 days later, Morrison stood in the arena's preparation chamber, adjusting unfamiliar ceremonial armor. As the new arena master, he was expected to dress the part, and Vorthan's ceremonial gear was elaborate to the point of absurdity. His first official challenge was scheduled to begin in an hour. Word had spread throughout the sector about the human who had defeated Zethkar, and warriors from dozens of species had arrived hoping to claim the title for themselves. Morrison's first challenger was a Krillian berserker named Thaxmore, standing nearly 4 meters tall and armed with weapons that could punch through starship armor. Intelligence reports suggested he was fast, brutal, and had never lost a single combat. In other words, exactly the kind of opponent Morrison had been fighting his entire career. A chime announced that it was time for the pre-combat ceremonies. Morrison checked his weapons one final time. He had been allowed to select his own gear this time, and had chosen equipment more suited to his fighting style. As he walked toward the arena entrance, Morrison thought about the 20 humans who were supposedly being processed for release. He had no guarantee that Vex then would keep her word, but holding the arena master position gave him at least some leverage to ensure compliance. More importantly, his victory over Zethkar had already begun changing how other species viewed humanity. Intelligence reports from across the sector suggested that several minor powers were reconsidering their assumptions about human military capabilities. Some were even reaching out to establish formal diplomatic relations with Earth. Morrison smiled grimly as the arena doors began to open. Sometimes the best way to prevent a war was to demonstrate that you were prepared to fight one. The crowd's roar washed over him as he stepped into the light, carrying with him 43 years of hard-earned wisdom about war, survival, and what it meant to be the person others counted on to come home. Behind him, the arena's communication systems broadcast his fight to audiences across the galaxy. Beings who had never heard of humanity were about to learn that humans might be more than they appeared. And in the depths of space, human colonial navy ships were already being quietly repositioned to support their newly prominent citizen should diplomacy fail. The galaxy was about to discover that humans took care of their own, regardless of the cost. Morrison gripped his weapons and walked forward to face his next challenge, knowing that each victory bought time and safety for people he would probably never meet but had sworn to protect. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of impossible situation he had spent his career preparing for. The only question was how many warriors he would have to face before the lesson finally took hold.